What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Will Turbot here for Demand the Truth. We have a very special guest joining us today. We're going to be talking about the plight of our children under governmental care. Some places, Child Protective Services. Here in Rhode Island, it's DCYF, Department of Children, Youth, and Families. Here in Rhode Island, as I've documented, the former head of DCYF, Trista Piccola, on April 4th of this year said that 20 to 25 children go missing in her care in the tiniest state of Rhode Island every single day. When she was asked as a follow-up question, well, how many don't come back? She says, well, I don't know. And we've had kids die in DCYF care this year. And actually a number of kids have been driven around and pimped out under their care. So it's a very atrocious thing when people who are paid to take care of our most vulnerable kids are not doing so. And then at least here in Rhode Island, not anybody gets fired or goes to jail. But we have a writer here and for the Daily Caller and other art outlets. Sorry, I'm very caffeinated right now. It's been a long day. But yeah, we have Michael Volpe joining us. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and thank you for joining, Michael.
Thank you for having me. I started becoming a freelance investigative journalist in 2010. I think I went full time. And so I've done that. I've been published all over the globe. The industry spread where securities trading is out of Australia. And since late 2013, I've been looking at courts and specifically family court. And as you said, Child Protective Services, CYS, it's called DCYF over in Rhode Island. And so I've been doing a lot of investigation on that and the VA since the 2014. I talked to over 20 VA whistleblowers, and incidentally, to a man and woman, they will tell you things, at least as far as retaliation is concerned, are as bad, if not worse, than they were in 2014. So don't let anyone believe you that the VA is anywhere near fixed. As far as Child Protective Services, there's similar numbers in Arizona in terms of kids missing. And again, inexplicable. They go missing and they don't know where they are. And so it is a complete mess all over the country. And part of it is that they're incentivized to take kids. They get money. They meaning CPS. That started with a law in the 70s called the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. But the main law now is the Adoption and Safe Families Act. And what both of those laws do is they give the state money. Every kid, every month, really every second they're in foster care. And then when that money runs out, and does run out, I think in a year and a half or maybe 15 months, there's even more money for every adoption. Nancy Schaefer, who was a state representative, I think, out of Georgia, who did a lot of work on this in the corrupt business of CPS, called this double dipping, meaning you get money while they're in foster care, get even more money to adopt them out. And Bill Clinton, who signed that law, this was his intent. Now, he didn't understand the nefarious nature. He saw too many kids in foster care. Hey, so we got to move them from foster care to adoption. So let's incentivize adoption. What he didn't understand is what CPS did is we'll just take more kids, get as many of them into foster care. Now let's move them into adoption because we're making money on both ends. And so that is the situation. It's not being talked about a lot. However, I'd say over the last 2-3 years, it's talked about a lot more. When I first started this in 2013, everybody said there was a guy named Keith Harmon Snow who does good work. But that's what everybody said. There's one guy looking at this stuff, and there's a lot more than one person. And by the way, Keith wrote a great book called The Worst Interest of the Child, where he described child trafficking, mostly in Connecticut, but in New England, documented more than 70 cases where kids are placed in abusive situations. And either CPS is not involved or CPS looks the other way. I don't remember what it's called over there, but they're a version of CPS. And so over 70 cases, and if he found over 70, how many are there?
Yeah, I'd be interested to look into that because I'm in tiny Rhode Island myself. Connecticut is right next door, Massachusetts. And we do have this area, even National Fox News reported a while back that there were finding individuals with children from foster care system all throughout, because it seems like Rhode Island might be a little halfway point between New York and Boston, and we do have Newport. We still have some very affluent people living out there too. I wanted to briefly ask you about Arizona. And I've been seeing some things going on in Arizona lately, and I'm going to potentially be taking a trip out there very soon. What's going on in Arizona, and what should I be looking into when I go there?
Well, it's had a problem for a long time. Before 2014, it was called Child Protective Services, and it was part of a larger agent, or it was part of a larger agency, I think they called it. And it got such a mess that then Governor Jan Brewer decided to close up CPS and create a cabinet level post, the Department of Child Safety. So that was the cabinet level post. We're going to fix things. And all the activists I talked to say nothing's been fixed. So they have most recently been speaking to a state legislator. I don't remember if he's a senator or representative. Farnsworth is his last name. And the main villain on the political side, her name is Kate Brophy McGee. So she runs, I think it's the Health and Human Services Committee, but she's like the conduit to the money for DCS. And so she makes sure the money flows, and any bills that might hinder CPS will die, and any bills that help them move forward. And the activists were talking to Farnsworth, and she basically threatened him, and he went to the local police, and that blew up. But Farnsworth kind of sounded like a conspiracy theorist, or at least that's the way they portrayed him in the media, that there's a child trafficking ring, and I know it, I just can't prove it. And look, when you take kids for federal funds, that's child trafficking. Trafficking is the movement of things for money. Child trafficking is the movement of kids for money. So if CPS, or whatever it's called, is taking the child just to get federal funds, that's child trafficking. So I think he's not, 2 and 2 equals 4. He just doesn't understand it equals 4. He's on the right track. But when you say, child trafficking, but I can't prove it, well, and I think he may have even said they're moved to pedophiles. Well, there are famous cases. Baby Devani was first placed with a guy who was running a pedophile ring. When they caught him, they placed her with a woman who scalded 80% of her body. Well, that you're moving kids to a pedophile. So there are documented cases of it, but he's certainly portrayed a bit as a conspiracy theorist, but it's been a problem for well over a decade. And the activists I talked to say there's really no fix from 2014 when they did this big reform where they changed everything around. It's no longer CPS, it's DCS, it's cabinet level. That was supposed to fix things. I don't think it's fixed anything. The article I did, you saw, I think it got up to 19,000 kids were in foster care around 2016. It's dropped down to around 14,000. But really, the numbers are roughly the same, and they're getting money on all those kids. And so what you're going to see is DCS taking kids for haphazard reasons, and judges far too often just acting as a rubber stamp. The other thing you'll see is judges believe these social workers over the parents. And why do they believe them? In my opinion, it's because the social worker's in the court every week. The parent's there for the first time. So who are you going to believe? The person you've seen 200 times or the person you've never seen? And so whatever the social worker says, that's what the judge believes, and it becomes a rubber stamp. They have the really notorious case where with just a judicial order, DCS shows up with a SWAT team from the police, knocks down a door. It's Chandler, Arizona, because a kid had a fever, and the parents, against doctor's advice, just took the kid home. And the doctor thought, oh my God, with a fever, I don't know how high the temperature was, but my God, a fever, how dare you? And actually had not only DCS show up, but the equivalent, you can see it, the equivalent of a SWAT team. And we know very little about that case because the judge signed a gag order, so the parents are gagged, but the video got out, and that caused a firestorm, and that caused a lot of scrutiny of Arizona. But it's very corrupt. But I don't look. I think if more people scrutinize Rhode Island, it would look as corrupt. It's not that Arizona is necessarily that much more corrupt than any other state. It's receiving more scrutiny.
What I think people need to keep in the back, actually the front of their minds, this would be in the forefront of everybody's minds. This is probably the greatest civil rights problem of our generation here. This is probably only second to slavery in our country's history. And the reason I say that is because, well, maybe this guy is saying, well, they're taking kids for money. Regardless of that, they are stealing children. And I will specify how they're doing that. In family courts all across the United States and other places in the world, people have their children taken without a warrant, without a lot of times without a lawyer, and almost every single time. I've never seen one case. You're probably more diligent on this issue than I am. I've never seen a case where kids were taken by a jury of their peers. This never happens. A lot of times it's not even a crime committed. So what you people watching at home need to understand is they are taking people's kids without a warrant, without a jury of your peers. I mean, even pedophiles and murderers get to be judged by a jury of the peers, but people are having their kids taken from them. And even worse, the government's getting money from that. So this is absolutely atrocious. I want to talk about some specific cases you've written about, but I also wanted to quickly ask you before we get into Ms. Bukowski's case, what is the reasoning for this? Now, I've heard a couple things. Some people say there's people in high places that want to run these kids, and I'm sure in every place psychopaths do get into power, right? Because there's good people that want to be cops, and there's bad people that want to be cops. Same thing with the government, same thing with teachers, same thing with that. So I'm sure that's going to happen too. Is it negligence? Because there are also a lot of people in this that are great people. I mean, there's a lot of great social workers out there that have nothing but the best intentions in their mind. So where is the disconnect? Why do we have this situation where it's just out of control?
Great question. First of all, if you want to look at another human rights violation, probate, where older folks are put into guardianship, almost the same thing, reversed, except not children, but the elderly. What you said, first of all, it's not a court of law, it's a court of equity, which the rules are completely different. Second of all, as you said, even pedophiles and murderers get more rights. Why? Because when your children are taken, you technically not committed a crime. Third of all, this isn't law enforcement. These are social workers. They're not as well trained. Fourth of all, and most importantly, CPS, nobody knows what their rules are. They can show up without a warrant and take your kid. And then if you say, give me a warrant, well, then they'll show up and take your kid. They'll use the fact that you wouldn't let them in because you claimed you needed a warrant. A year or two ago, Megan Fox at PJ Media had this kind of a story out of Mississippi where CPS showed up, or whatever they're called over there. The guy demanded that they get a warrant. She comes back and just takes the kid. Demanded I wanted a warrant. Now I'm going to take the kid. It's a combination of all of those things. And then again, because you get money, that becomes an incentive. So you want to maximize the number of kids taken. So you don't really need a reason, because it's abuse and neglect. What does that mean? Abuse and neglect mean whatever you want it to mean. As I've pointed out, the hypothetical scenario that I have seen, it's 55 degrees out. You let your kid walk out barefoot. Oh, abuse and neglect. Is that enough to take a kid? It can be. It's enough if you have the right social worker and the right judge. And because these are nebulous, very difficult to define terms, abuse and neglect, they can come up with whatever reason they want. You have the money. You have the money incentive, you have the lack of rules, you have the lack of training. The other thing that people need to understand, they're almost always understaffed, overwhelmed, so they don't have the ability to do the proper investigation as well. I think they get incentives and bonuses each and every one. I can't prove that, but I do believe that they're not doing it just for the greater monetary good. They're also doing it for their own good. I know that I've read stories out of New Zealand where their version of CPS, where they've actually been caught on tape saying things like that, where a parent would say, I want my kid back. What do you mean? I'm going to lose my bonus. So it's certainly happening in New Zealand. And by the way, this is a global problem. I've read stories all around the world, Canada, England, Australia, New Zealand, as I said. There was a big story out of Italy. It's a global problem, CPS that is, and taking kids, stealing kids. And you're absolutely right. The human rights violations are almost unprecedented, except, in my opinion, in guardianship. Want to see it's the same thing over there. Again, court of equity, put them in guardianship. And it's trafficking for money, because once somebody's in guardianship, you can loot their estate. And that's why most of those people are put in guardianship. Same type of thing. And by the way, there's often an adult protective services, which is the equivalent for old people. So it's really a similar system. with Dad.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's, we can't just blame the government itself because, people have to be involved non-violently. Otherwise, this is what happens. All it takes for evil to triumph is for good men and women to do nothing. And when we have this unchecked power and combine that with being understaffed and the lack of accountability and oversight, it's just a perfect disaster for what's going on. But let's get into this article that you wrote for the Daily Caller. Because let's personalize this and humanize it. It's a very well written article too. It's about an incredible story. I mean, when I heard this story, I was literally heartbroken, and I always talk right, and I couldn't. So the title of the Daily Caller. If you guys are scoring at home, please go get this article and share it with your family and friends. Chicago police, courts, and protective services ignored warnings before the death of 2-year-old girl. Tell us about this article, please.
It's a 2-year-old boy, but it's Carol Witkowski is the parent. And they said Chicago. It's actually Chicagoland area. Chicago doesn't need to get smeared. But this happened in Kane County, which is about 50 miles northwest of Chicago. Her son died on October 31st of this year. Before that, over this previous several months, her ex-boyfriend had raped her once in 2018, once in 2019, admitted to it in text messages and then in court, admitted to the text messages in court. He also was found with child porn. Those two things were brought to the Elgin Police Department. He was, I think, charged in one case, not even charged in the other case, but never tried or convicted. Then in April of 2019, her children, or either one of her children, came back home. They had bruises, or she found bruises. She took it to the Palatine Police Department. I remember in the police report, Palatine kept questioning, we can't see bruise, we can't see a bruise. She would say it, they'd question her. Her friends would say it, they'd question them. And I called Kira about that. And I said, they're saying there's no bruise. And she goes, that's funny. Because when I took the kid to the hospital, they said contusion. And she gave me the medical report. So it looks like the Palatine Police Department really screwed up in April. And that's very important. At that point, from that point forward, what happened is the same. We have 3 cases, by the way, not just this case, 3 cases, same judge, John Dalton, basically without any due process in a hearing where I believe she wasn't even there because she was told it's just a simple hearing. My lawyer is going to recuse herself. He switches custody, gives some bogus excuse, changes custody. And it got to the point where she had supervised visit, which is the biggest scam, where you pay to see your kid and some bureaucrat is looking over your shoulder while you're spending time with your kid. And it got to the point where she was basically not allowed to see either of her kids. October 31st, her son is found dead in the custody of her ex, and I believe living with the grandfather and her ex, so her ex and then his dad. He's 2 years old. The police get there. They can't explain. No one can explain how the kid dies. Okay, 2 years old, right? Within 24 hours, and it's the Palatine Police, same police. And by the way, this is called DCFS, was supposedly investigating all of these things. And one other thing that's very important. So they called it unfounded. When you make this accusation, if it's unfounded, it's always used against you. And that's exactly what happened in Kira's case. There's a guardian at Lytham who said, she's basically obsessed with getting at her ex, so she keeps saying these things. So that's one of the reasons why she lost custody. But DCFS was investigating these things. And now Palatine Police, the same police department, within 24 hours on November 1st, puts out a press release and says, there's no suspicion of foul play. 2-year-old is dead. Multiple adults are in the house. No one can explain why the 2-year-old is dead, but they can't find any signs of foul play. So then it's taken, Palatine's in Cook County. And by the way, for people, if you want a reference point, in the early 1990s, Palatine is where the brutal Brown's chicken murder happened, where I think there was 7 people stacked up in a refrigerator. It was a thrill kill. So that's the same town. So it's taken to the Cook County Medical Examiner's office. Number one, she starts talking to the detective at Palatine, and he is just making excuses for these people. He's saying, number one, well, they looked like they were sad. Well, we couldn't find any outward evidence of foul play, meaning ligature marks, bruises, whatever, blunt force trauma, as they always say. They couldn't find any of it. Now, keep that in mind. They said they couldn't find any of it. Then she gets a call from the Cook County Medical Examiner's office, who has the gall to say, you may never know. You're right. You may never know how your kid died. He's 2 years old. He just died. So she finally has her own private autopsy done. They find a bruise in the muscle underneath the muscle underneath the shoulder, I think, and also like blue around the nose. So that was the blue around the nose. I think it was a discoloration around the nose, I should say. That was what they called consistent with strangulation. Why is it consistent? Because they didn't give the autopsy person the neck muscle, the brain, or the heart, so you couldn't do the proper testing. And what the private autopsy person said is normally that's because they want to do extra testing. So when Cook County was saying, we don't know, we have no idea, you may never know, they might have an inkling, because it's not like they kept the knee. It's not like they kept the private area. They didn't keep the ankle. They didn't keep the stomach. They kept the head, the heart, and the neck. So they kept 3 specific parts. That's where the case is at. Now, she's finally getting some custody with her older. I think she's either 3 or 4. And as I said, there's 2 other cases, same judge, same DCFS, and Holly Sathern is one of the 2, same DCFS caseworker. Her name is Amanda Petrikowski. In Holly's case, her ex has police reports in 5 counties. Think about that. A lot of people don't visit 5 counties in their lives. He has police reports in 5 counties. All right, including beating her up to the point where she broke her nose, stealing all kinds of things. And her 5-year-old is saying that daddy sticks a screwdriver into me, picking my butt. This is the kind of things you're hearing now. On the flip side, in 2016, she was with her son and she was drinking. She had been drinking. In 2019, she was caught completely drunk and she was pregnant, not with her son, but she was pregnant. After the 2019 incident, she was placed on supervised visitation. Now that's slowly been taken away, but she is now the guy with 5 police reports in 5 counties. He's the one with physical custody. Physical custody means 50% plus 1 or more, anywhere up to 100%, meaning the majority of the time the kid is with him. And he, by the way, has also failed a couple of drug tests. And I should say the ex has denied everything. I mean, everything, including even beating up Holly. And there's 2 police reports. One time he got convicted. The third one, Jessica Caston, her kids come home after July 4th weekend. It's not quite July 4th, maybe 5th, 6th or 7th. And they disclose that their dad, and I think she had twins, that their dad was molesting them. She does what you're told to do immediately within a day or 2. Police, hospital, and DCFS. It's Batavia, and this is all in the same general area. Batavia is in Kane County. They start the investigation. As soon as DCFS gets involved, they seem to have ceded because the police report basically stops. And what DCFS told her is, we had within a month they closed it, and they claimed because he passed a lie detector test. That's what they told her. She never even saw the report. And by the way, when I called him and I asked him, did you molest your daughters? He wouldn't answer. He said, I have no comment. Look, take that for what you will. If you get caught off guard by a media person, who knows how you'll respond? Be that as it may.
You can ask me anytime if I've molested anybody. Throw that in there anytime. The answer is a hard no. Okay.
Right. Right. He wouldn't answer. He wouldn't answer.
And now I want to ask you too, because this kind of goes back to my other question too, but this is a separate case. Now, certain things could fail because of oversight or whatever, but this case specifically and some of these other cases related, this is a systematic failure. It's not just DCF or CPS. You got the police involved. You got the medical assessment. How does that happen on so many things? Are they just covering each other's asses here?
They seem to be, and it seemed to be on the fly. And I should mention most recent, number 1, she got called by McHenry County, which is another county. So you got Cook, Kane, McHenry County, like a deputy sheriff, something like that, some sort of detective who started hassling her because Kara got called within like 2-3 weeks of the death of her son, because she had put on Facebook words to the effect of, if CPS shows up without a warrant and no good reason and takes my child, do we have the right to our Second Amendment? And that was clearly political speech. In fact, not only was it political speech, it's the exact sort of thing that the founding fathers wanted to protect. And by the way, was it provocative? Of course it was provocative. Provocative is good sometimes. We don't have a carve out for.
Founding fathers made the First Amendment specifically for provocative speech. Don't you think it's a little provocative saying, hey, we might want to get away from this jerk of a king? I mean, the First Amendment is not about the weather. It's exactly for that. You're absolutely right. Continue.
Right. Yeah. And so he basically had a 7-minute political discussion with her, badgering this woman 2-3 weeks after her son died. The funeral home, it's Hultgren funeral home. They, number one, buried her son without telling her. And then the head of the home called the cops, and she was actually visited by police around midnight a few days ago and had to explain what the deal was. She said, I only called once or twice. Last thing is, I don't remember the term that Cook County is now using, but they are headed, I would say the equivalent of headed in the direction of calling it strangulation of her son. So this whole no evidence of foul play, I think that Palatine's going to have to eat those words. But we are now a month and a half into the investigation. You had multiple adults in a home, or I don't know where it was, in a living area. A 2-year-old dies with no explanation, and no one has been arrested. Well, and by the way, the father still has physical custody as John Dalton, and I've talked to at least 10 people total, including these 3 who are victims of Dalton, and it's everything from bogus child support to just tyrannical behavior to stories that are similar to this. But this guy is a tyrant. He's a bad guy and a bad judge. John Dalton. People need to look out for him.
Well, you've been very gracious with your time, and I want to thank you very much for being the definition of what a journalist should be. You're not wearing 17 extra pounds of makeup. You're not taking money from Big Pharma. You're reporting on the real muckraking stories that these people don't want to hear. You're not regurgitating impeachment or Russia collusion. I would be remiss to let you go. Any final points that you want to talk about too? Yes. But also, I definitely want. I first want to implore the audience here to get involved non-violently, because you definitely don't want to wait until it's your kid they steal, then you become an activist. We have to be preemptive with this non-violently. But would you, any other points that you'd like to make, take your time with that, but also too, any best practices for people dealing with this themselves, any advice that you would give?
People have asked me that. I don't think so, because if you do everything they say, that's CPS, they'll run all over you. If you try to assert your rights, they'll get upset. The real answer is reform.
Don't have kids.
Right, no, right. You do not call CPS on people. It's the worst thing. I don't wish that on your enemies. You asked me one final point. The most important case, the case I'm most involved in, the Rucky case. David Rucky versus Sandra Grazzini Rucky. If that sounds familiar, you may have seen it on 2020. That's a show called Footprints in the Snow, a complete hatchet job. David Rucky, I'm going to list it out. According to a CPS report, stuck a gun to his then 8-year-old son's head. According to an audio recording, threw one of his daughters and started choking her on a sofa. According to a police report, chased after another daughter on her 13th birthday until she barricaded herself in her house. He threatened his neighbors, threatened his in-laws, threatened his neighbors so much that they installed a video camera on top of their house. In 1994, he was in a bar fight. 2014, a road rage incident because a guy flicked him off, beat him up, bloodied him, and then went shopping. And I asked Sam, that's what Sandra Grazzini Rucky goes by. That's because it's like a compulsion. After he fights, he needs to go eat. This guy has sole custody of his kids. And by the way, I said CPS report. Yeah, CPS obviously did a bang-up job investigating this guy. Sandra Grazzini Rucky is a 6-time felon. Why? Her kids, 2 of her 5 kids, on April 19, 2013, ran because they were told they were going to live with their paternal aunt, and the plan was to live with their father. She was protecting them. How did they do it? Courts can hide evidence. In the custody trial, in the criminal trial, everything that I said was not allowed in. And by the way, the 8-year-old, his name is Nico. He testified at his father's trial and said, I've never seen my father be violent. Even despite saying that CPS report was never entered into evidence. So he was allowed to say he's never seen his father be violent, even though he told CPS his father stuck a gun to his head. And that's how they convicted her. And how did they convict her on 2020? Everything you heard, they didn't put that in. And that's a very important story. It involves the media, the police, CPS, and the courts. And by the way, let me give 2 things. First of all, the judge in the divorce trial, David Knudsen, I wrote a book called Sandra Grazzini and Rucky in the World's Last Custody Trial. Why the World's Last Custody Trial? I wrote it with her lawyer. I should mention that, Michelle McDonald. She performed part of it, handcuffed to a wheelchair. He forced her, handcuffed in a wheelchair, to perform part of the custody. And by the way, David Rucky got sole custody 100% of everything, as the ex's attorney was handcuffed in a wheelchair. Then 2009, David Rucky this is again with the neighbors, screaming uncontrollably, swearing at 2 and 3-year-olds, gets charged with disorderly conduct. On the eve of trial, it gets dismissed for a lack of probable cause, even though there's half a dozen witnesses. And if you're going to dismiss it, it's supposed to be in pretrial. The judge, her name is Karen Asfog. She just happened to wind up on Sandra Grazzini Rucky's criminal trial. Dee Dee Evervold, who put her in touch with Doug and Gina Dolan. Doug and Gina Dolan were the couple who the 2 girls that Samantha and Gianna, and they're both over 18, lived with for approximately 2.5 years. I'm sure just by coincidence, she not only dismissed this case, but wound up on all 4 trials. And oh yeah, it's something called a motion in limine. She made sure none of the evidence I just heard was allowed in the courts. Very important case.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. You're very well spoken. I'm going to make sure that we put the links to everything that you do in the description. I just want to say, you blew me away today. You're very well spoken, very passionate, very intelligent. I hope you come back on in the new year so we can continue the discussion, because this is just like the most important topic that we have to deal with. People need to start taking some nonviolent action. And lastly, what's the best place for people to reach you and follow your work? Because you put out a lot of great stuff.
I do. I actually have 2 wrongful convictions coming up, hopefully in the next 2 or 3 weeks for Daily Caller. I have a blog called The Provocateur where I link to all of my articles, and I have articles all over the place. 4 books. The first one is called Prosecutors Gone Wild, about a bogus prosecution of a guy named Chuck Panici. The second one, A Definitive Dossier of PTSD and Whistleblowers. Many whistleblowers have PTSD. The third one is Bullied to Death, about a guy, Chris Mackney, who killed himself during a divorce in Virginia. And then the fourth one, Sandra Grazzini Rucky and the World's Last Custody Trial. You'll see it blow by blow. Though that book was written in 2016, many things have happened. By the way, David Rucky, even though he got 100% of a multi-million-dollar estate, is chasing after his ex, who is now homeless and jobless, for child support. And child support is a whole other issue that's completely jacked up. You're right. This is very serious. Can I give you in 1 minute why more people don't come? Yeah. I believe that our media is so partisan that unless you can either blame or credit the president, and this is any president, it's not just Trump, then they don't care. So CPS, social services, you can't blame or credit Trump, so they don't care. And that's why I think it doesn't get the amount that it deserves. And I think wrongful convictions, guardianship, all of those things don't get as much coverage because, again, you can't blame Trump, can't credit Trump, nobody cares.
You're absolutely right, Michael. Thank you very much. You enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you for being gracious with your time, and keep up your amazing work. We need 1,000 more of you.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Have a great night.